It's a funny thing how people who could freeze to death in an afternoon somehow became master chefs of nothingness. In the Arctic, what's for dinner wasn't a question so much as a philosophical riddle. You had snow, wind, and the occasional thing with a heartbeat. That was the menu. And yet, people not only survived, but turned that bleak pantry into a biochemical triumph of taste and time. While the rest of the world debated seasoning, Arctic survival was about not dying of hunger, hypothermia, or boredom, preferably in that order. There's a quiet genius to eating in a place that's trying to kill you. The Inuit, Chukchi, Sami, Iwenki, all of them developed cuisines that could outlast the sun itself. When winter dropped its curtain for 6 months, they didn't light candles and weep into empty bowls. They fermented, froze, dried, rendered, and stored. They built edible calendars in the dark, where every jar of fat or skinned bag of seal oil was a promise that the stomach would make it to spring. Modern people like to talk about slow food. Arctic people invented it by necessity. Their dinner took 6 months and a bacterial colony to prepare. There were no grocery stores, of course, just endless white silence and the occasional mammal regretting its life choices. So survival depended on knowing how to turn one lucky kill into a dozen meals, and then make those meals last until the next lucky kill. Fermentation, freezing, and fat were the 3 religions of the North. And unlike most religions, these came with tangible miracles: edible food, warm houses, and functioning organs. Imagine this: you're standing in a landscape where metal snaps in the cold, where your breath freezes mid-air and falls like invisible glass. You can't plant wheat, you can't bake bread, you can barely blink, but you can dig into the ice and find last year's fermented fish still waiting, soft and tangy, as if time itself decided to preserve it. Survival here wasn't about innovation, it was about obedience to nature's chemistry. Humans simply learned to let bacteria and frost handle the cooking. That's what's so striking about Arctic diets. They weren't primitive, they were biochemical partnerships. Every bite was a conversation between the human gut and the microbial world. People figured out long before laboratories that fermentation keeps meat safe, increases vitamins, and even makes it taste vaguely like cheese if you close your eyes and stop asking questions. Their so-called rotting food was in fact precision preservation. Where southern civilizations built granaries, the Arctic built bacterial ecosystems. And that's what turns this story from survival into something almost mythic. It's not just about enduring cold, it's about adapting the entire idea of food. To the untrained eye, it looked like madness: burying meat in snow, letting seal intestines bubble in pits, leaving berries to sit until they turned to jam on their own. But under that quiet decay was a form of intelligence, so sharp it could only come from desperation. Humans became custodians of rot, caretakers of invisible life that made their own possible. It's darkly poetic, really, the way bacteria became humanity's most reliable ally when the gods seemed to have abandoned them. While the tundra gave nothing, microbes whispered, "Don't worry, we'll handle this," and they did. Which is why, when people speak of the invention of fermentation, they're missing the point. No one invented it. They just noticed that life refuses to stop growing, even in death. And from that realization came the first edible form of time travel. Food that carried you from one frozen season into another. Preservation wasn't just practical, it was existential insurance. The Arctic meal was memory, trust, and survival all rolled into one pungent serving. Because if you could eat yesterday's catch 6 months later and still wake up breathing, well, you'd probably start to think bacteria were the real gods anyway. If there's one thing humans have always been good at, it's making decay look intentional. Fermentation, that elegant word for let's see what happens if we don't throw this away, was civilization's quiet rebellion against the calendar. In the Arctic, it wasn't a culinary hobby. It was the difference between existence and extinction. When the sun vanished and the air turned solid, food had to outthink time. So people learned to make bacteria their unpaid staff. The process looked unholy to outsiders. Fish stuffed into sealskin bags, buried under permafrost. Meat wrapped in moss, left to sweat gently under the snow. Seabirds packed whole feathers, beaks, and all into the hollow body of a seal, then stitched tight and left to ferment for months. The result, kiviak, a dish that smells like the apocalypse but feeds an entire village through the long night. Western explorers called it rotten, Arctic families called it dinner. This wasn't random rot, It was microbial engineering with a spiritual side. Lactic acid bacteria, those microscopic alchemists, created an oxygen-free vault where proteins softened, vitamins multiplied, and harmful bacteria were outcompeted. No test tubes, no thermometers, just centuries of intuition and trust in invisible chemistry. Every fermented seal or fish was a biochemical time capsule, ticking quietly beneath the ice, waiting for famine to knock. And the irony, what looked like filth was nutrition's masterpiece. Fermentation prevented scurvy by preserving vitamin C in meat and fish. It made tough proteins digestible, replaced lost gut bacteria, and gave the immune system something to brag about. Modern dietitians would pay fortunes to invent what Arctic grandmothers already perfected in bone pits and sealskins. There's also an unsettling beauty in how this food mirrored its environment: cold, dark, slow, like winter itself. Nothing hurried, nothing wasted. The same stillness that froze the tundra also stabilized dinner. People didn't cook their food so much as negotiate with it. They understood that warmth wasn't always an ally. Sometimes it ruined things. Better to let the earth's chill and bacteria do the work, patient, invisible, and precise. Every culture in the north had its edible relics. The Chukchi fermented walrus agunak, the Nenets aged fish under ice, the Inuit buried whale skin and blubber muktak until it reached the texture of butter and the smell of divine punishment. These foods weren't merely eaten, they were revered. Opening a fermented cache was a ceremony. The oldest women, custodians of taste and tolerance, would inspect it first. One wrong smell, and the pit was resealed. One right scent, and the feast began. Fermentation turned the Arctic into a living archive of meals prepared months or even years before. It was a conversation with time, one where the ingredients whispered, "We're still here," and through them, so were the people. Because in the far north, survival wasn't about conquering nature. It was about collaborating with decay. They didn't preserve food to fight time. They learned to eat it. At some point, someone must have realized that fresh was an overrated concept. In the Arctic, freshness meant you'd just killed something, and if you didn't eat it immediately, it froze solid faster than you could pronounce dinner. So, the real culinary magic lay in keeping food almost dead, but not quite, suspended in a limbo between meal and memory. That's where fermented soups and semi-rotted stews entered the story, the fine art of eating bacteria's homework. What southern kitchens called spoilage, Arctic cooks called progress. The line between poison and preservation was thin, but these people danced on it daily, guided by smell, season, and ancestral instinct. The most famous examples, igunak, kifiak, tipa, fermented fish heads, were experiments in biochemical restraint. You didn't boil them, you didn't fry them. You simply hid them from oxygen, sealed them from light, and prayed the right microbes showed up to dinner. When they did, they transformed tough, frozen protein into something you could chew, digest, and even enjoy if you ignored your nose. These weren't accidents, they were the Arctic's first laboratories. The container mattered sealskin, moss, stone, snow. Each offered a different bacterial palette. Sealskin provided the perfect airtight cocoon. Moss added a touch of earthy insulation. Snow gave temperature control better than any Michelin-starred fridge. Over time, people learned which combinations created the safest rot, which smelled wrong, and which might make your ancestors spin in their graves, or join you for supper, depending on your belief system. Modern science eventually caught up to what Arctic survivalists already knew. Fermentation is the controlled oxidation of food by friendly microorganisms. It creates lactic acid, which kills pathogens, boosts vitamins, and adds that charmingly indescribable flavor, halfway between old cheese and regret. Those soupy, pungent meals weren't reckless. They were chemistry disguised as folk wisdom. The result was food that could last an entire winter, nourishing the gut, keeping scurvy at bay, and ensuring your descendants would one day terrify anthropologists with their dietary habits. There's a quiet poetry in the sight of a fermented soup pot thawing over a seal oil flame, bubbles rising slowly, releasing the ghosts of last summer's catch. It didn't eat such food casually. It carried history in its smell. It reminded you that everything edible comes from something that once decayed. The Arctic just had the decency to admit it, and there was humor in it too. Outsiders gagged, but locals laughed. The same explorers who mocked rotten fish were often found chewing it a few weeks later, grateful for the strength it gave them to not die in the snow. That's the thing about disgust, it tends to vanish when you're starving. So yes, Arctic soups didn't spoil because people refused to let the cold dictate what counted as food. They built a cuisine out of bacterial choreography, one that thrived precisely because it flirted with disaster. Each spoonful was a victory against entropy, warm, oily, and slightly horrifying, but victorious nonetheless. And from these bubbling, stinking miracles rose a new principle of life at the edge. If you can't fight decay, learn to dine with it. It turns out, the Arctic invented the freezer long before anyone thought to plug one in. The difference? This one didn't hum in the corner of your kitchen, it howled. Imagine a land where everything solidifies on contact with air, where leftovers aren't refrigerated but entombed. Here, winter wasn't the enemy. It was your most reliable storage system. Forget expiration dates. If you buried it right, your fish would outlive you. These frozen pantries weren't random holes in the ground. They were engineering marvels of ice and instinct. Families carved food caches into permafrost, lined them with stones, and sealed them with moss to keep out scavengers. The ground did the rest. Constant sub-zero temperatures preserved meat in perfect stasis. Archaeologists have even found ancient stores of whale meat and fish so well frozen that thousands of years later, they could still recognize the cuts. That's not just preservation, that's cryogenic devotion. But freezing wasn't just about safety. It was social. Meat kept underground belonged to the group. It could be unearthed in times of scarcity or celebration, distributed by elders who remembered whose hands had hauled which carcass from which ice hole. These pits weren't just food storage, they were memory vaults, edible records of cooperation. Every frozen slab was a receipt of generosity. In the Arctic, to hoard food was treason against the ecosystem itself. There's a quiet brilliance in that arrangement. The same environment that froze your eyelashes became your pantry. The permafrost wasn't dead land, it was refrigeration powered by geology. And unlike modern freezers, this one required no electricity, no repairs, just a good sense of direction and the humility to share. The menu was remarkable in its simplicity. Fish stacked in frozen layers like edible bricks, seal cuts wrapped in snow, blubber preserved under rock. Some families even stored entire carcasses, the body a container, the ice the lid. When the time came to eat, the meal emerged from its icy tomb like something resurrected. It had texture, flavor, a story. Every bite reminded you that survival was less about innovation and more about synchronization, living in tune with the freezing rhythm of the earth. And while southerners panicked at frostbite, northern hunters embraced it. Frost was a teacher. It showed them that the cold could heal as well as harm, protect as well as destroy. They didn't battle winter. They outsourced their preservation to it. The cold did what salt did for others. It locked time. So, while much of the world was smoking meat in panic or sun-drying in haste, the Arctic was quietly perfecting the art of freezing without fuss. There's irony in the fact that this brutal climate, famous for ending expeditions, was also the most reliable butler humanity ever had. To live there meant accepting the ice as kin, ruthless, but dependable. It held your food, your breath, your secrets, all neatly preserved, until you were ready to unearth them again. And when the thaw came, and the buried stores surfaced like ghosts from another season, people gathered around them with the reverence of an ancient ritual, because they were somewhere between all the fat, meat, and existential frostbite. The Arctic managed to hide its most unlikely luxury: berries, tiny, stubborn, and acid enough to make your teeth apologize. They were the jewels of the tundra, nature's vitamins, disguised as candy for people who'd never seen an orange. When the ice melted and the moss softened, the land exploded in reds, purples, and golds. For a few brief weeks each summer, survival actually tasted sweet. But make no mistake, these weren't delicate fruits meant for Instagram salads. They were biochemical weapons. Lingonberries, cloudberries, crowberries, cranberries, all engineered by evolution to defy decay. Their secret ingredient, benzoic acid, kept them fresh without refrigeration. While southern empires were dying of scurvy, northern hunters were quietly sipping antioxidant smoothies from wooden bowls. No ships, no citrus, no problem. Just a handful of berries that refused to rot. It's poetic, really. In a landscape where even metal froze brittle, these berries glowed like soft embers on the ground. The Sami picked them by the bucket, mixing them with reindeer milk or drying them for storage. Inuit families mashed them with seal oil into a high-calorie paste that could last for months. In Chukchi settlements, fermented berry soups were brewed, tart, luminous, and faintly alcoholic. Because even in prehistory, humans knew winter is easier with a buzz. Their use went beyond food. Berries were the Arctic's pharmacy. They treated wounds, cured infections, soothed sore throats, and sweetened the otherwise grim symphony of fat and fish. A few spoonfuls of cloudberries a day could replace an entire apothecary shelf. When explorers later arrived with their fancy tonics and tin cans, locals quietly watched them get sick and die of vitamin deficiency, probably while chewing a handful of frozen lingonberries and wondering how you could cross an ocean and still not learn to eat properly. And these fruits weren't just survival snacks, they were cultural punctuation marks. Every season of gathering was a communal act. Women, elders, children combing the tundra together, baskets filling with bright proof that the world hadn't ended yet. Berries marked the boundary between starvation and abundance, between despair and the brief promise of color. They were the only sweetness in a place that otherwise tasted like salt, smoke, and iron. Even today, Arctic berries remain nutritional enigmas. Studies show they contain some of the highest concentrations of antioxidants on Earth, as if they absorbed centuries of sunlight in advance, knowing the coming months would be dark. It's almost mystical, the way they stored light in edible form, like tiny batteries of summer tucked under snow. So when the northern wind howled and the stew smelled like fermented fish, despair, one spoonful of berry paste was enough to remind everyone that life still had flavor. It wasn't luxury, it was survival, disguised as desert. And just when the sweetness began to fade from the tongue, another taste would return, heavier, thicker, and shimmering with oil, reminding the Arctic that fat, not sugar, was the real god of warmth. In most of the world, fat is the enemy, a culinary scandal, a moral failing, a thing to burn off in January and rediscover in December. In the Arctic, however, it was nothing less than sacred. Fat was fire you could chew. It was insulation disguised as food, a miracle that turned whales, seals, and reindeer into walking furnaces. To eat fat was to survive. To waste it was practically heresy. Every culture north of the tree line had its own rituals around it. Whale blubber was sliced, rendered, or eaten raw. Seal oil was stored in skin bags, and reindeer tallow was melted into stews thick enough to frighten modern nutritionists. Fat fueled the body, the lamp, and the gods, often at the same time. In the dark months, lamps burned on seal oil, casting orange halos across snow huts, while the same oil simmered in pots nearby. Imagine heating your home, cooking your food, and honoring your ancestors with the same golden liquid. Efficiency elevated to theology. It wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Fat represented warmth, endurance, generosity. When someone shared their oil, they weren't feeding you, they were extending their fire. Among the Inuit, hunters who returned with whales or seals distributed the blubber publicly, a glowing, slippery communion. Children learned to value it early, dipping frozen meat into seal oil as casually as others dip bread in olive oil. Except this version could power a village. And for good reason. Arctic fat is dense in omega-3s south and vitamin D, two things the sun forgot to deliver. It fueled metabolism, protected against cold, and gave the immune system the strength to insult explorers in multiple languages. Science now applauds the very diet that missionaries once tried to civilize, forgetting that a life built on fat was not indulgence, but adaptation written in flesh and flame. The reverence for blubber bordered on metaphysical. Some myths claimed it held the spirit of the hunt, others that burning it wrongly could anger the sea goddess herself. Hunters learned early, carve cleanly, share widely, never mock the fat, it remembered. In many homes, pieces were kept as offerings to ancestral spirits, a kind of edible prayer for continued luck and full bellies. And there's an ironic symmetry in the way it all worked. Fat was both energy and emotion. It kept people alive, yes, but it also linked them. To be fat with someone meant to share comfort, to exist in mutual warmth. In communities where the world itself tried daily to freeze you solid, that was the highest compliment imaginable. Today, nutritionists package it as high-fat diets and ancestral eating, but they're late to the feast. Arctic families already perfected that balance, not as a trend, but as survival choreography. Fat was health insurance, spiritual connection, and central heating all in one jar. It glistened under the lamp like amber, smelling faintly of salt and divinity. reminding everyone that even in the coldest night, warmth could be eaten. And from those shimmering bowls of oil and blubber, a quieter truth emerged, that survival wasn't only stored in objects or shelters, but inside the very body itself. At some point, the Arctic stopped just shaping people. It started editing them. Generations of high-fat meals and low sunlight rewrote the human body like a biological diary. The result was a population that could eat what would kill most of us before dessert. Where outsiders saw a heart attack on a plate, northern hunters saw breakfast. Their secret wasn't luck. It was adaptation so elegant that even evolution must have applauded. The human metabolism down south runs on carbs, grains, roots, and the occasional moral crisis. But up north, carbs were as rare as good weather, so the body switched strategies. It learned to run on fat. The Inuit, for example, carry a genetic variant, CPT1A, that alters how their cells burn fuel. It's the metabolic equivalent of switching your engine from gasoline to whale oil. Instead of relying on sugar spikes, they turned blubber into body heat, energy, and survival. It wasn't a diet, it was genetic engineering by frost. And this wasn't the only trick. The Arctic gut became a miniature fermentation lab. The microbiome, that polite word for your internal bacteria, adjusted to digest what others couldn't. Raw meat, seal oil, fermented fish. It produced vitamins that the dark seasons forgot to provide, and it recycled every molecule of energy like a good accountant. You didn't eat despite the cold, you ate with it. There's a grim humor in realizing that Arctic bodies did what modern wellness gurus are still trying to sell. Ketosis, high-fat living, probiotic balance, except theirs didn't come in a subscription box. It came from starvation and a very persuasive climate. The ancestors didn't hack their metabolism. They just listened when winter said, adapt or die. The environment even crept into their blood. Researchers found higher levels of certain fatty acids that helped cells stay flexible in freezing temperatures. Basically, they became partially resistant to cold from the inside out, like nature's own antifreeze, circulating quietly under the skin. To live there was to become a hybrid of person and environment, neither fully separate nor fully safe. And there was philosophy in it too. The belief that you are what you eat wasn't metaphorical, it was biological law. To consume whale or seal wasn't just nourishment, it was communion. You absorbed the animal's strength, its endurance, its memory of migration. Eating the environment meant inheriting its resilience. You became an extension of the ecosystem that kept you alive, a mobile piece of the tundra wearing a parka. It's eerie, really, how porous the boundary between body and world became. The Arctic human wasn't just living in the landscape, they were metabolically of it, a walking climate adaptation, glowing faintly with vitamin D and defiance. And through that union, something else formed, a new way of remembering, not through writing or carving, but through digestion itself. Every meal became a story stored in cells, every generation another layer of survival encoded in blood and bone. Because in the Arctic, memory wasn't kept in libraries, it was kept in livers. In the Arctic, dinner was never just dinner. It was history, politics, and therapy served in one steaming bowl. Every meal was a collective act, not just of eating, but of remembering. When a family gathered around a pot of soup that had probably been fermenting since the last good seal hunt, they weren't only feeding their stomachs, they were feeding continuity. In a world where ink froze and paper tore like brittle skin, food became the archive. Recipes were never written, they were performed. Knowledge lived in the hands of the cook, in the rhythm of stirring and the precise moment when a smell crossed from still safe to try your luck. Every ingredient carried a name and a story: who caught it, where it was found, who survived on it last winter. The act of sharing food was the Arctic's oral history, narrated through taste. The Sami, the Inuit, the Chukchi, they didn't separate sustenance from storytelling. The two were one and the same. And because survival was communal, secrecy was pointless. You couldn't hide food from your neighbors when their hunger sounded exactly like yours. The rule was simple: you shared, or you shamed your ancestors. Meals were distributed according to unwritten hierarchies of respect. Elders first, hunters next, children last, but most loudly. Each bite reaffirmed social bonds stronger than any treaty. You didn't sit at a table, you sat inside a network of obligation. It's easy to romanticize that now, to imagine candlelit igloos and laughter echoing through the snow. The truth was harsher and more beautiful. To eat together was to guarantee survival, not comfort. When food was scarce, the strongest sometimes refused their portion, offering it to the very old or the very young. Anthropologists called it altruism. The locals called it Tuesday. Every pot was a communal memory bank, stirred daily and refilled with whatever fortune provided. The leftover fat from one hunt flavored the broth of the next. So each meal carried traces of past victories and losses. The ghost of a walrus here, the hint of a berry harvest there. In that sense, every dish was a time capsule, its flavor thick with the fingerprints of the dead and the generosity of the living. Even the tools of eating told stories. Bowls carved from driftwood passed through generations, polished by thousands of fingers. Spoons made from reindeer bone carried initials, drawings, or simply the wear of decades. When someone died, their utensils were sometimes buried with them, not out of superstition, but out of gratitude. After all, these were the instruments that had ferried memory from pot to mouth, from life to life. And when the wind howled and the lamps flickered, people didn't pray for better weather. They stirred the pot, kept it simmering, and let the smell remind them of all the winters they'd already survived. Because in the Arctic, to feed someone was to tell them who they were. And once the meal was done, and the bowls were empty, there was always a new story waiting, not in words this time, but in rhythm, as life itself began to pulse to the calendar of hunger and thaw. Time in the Arctic wasn't kept by clocks, but by cravings. There were no months, no real hours, just the alternating stomach states of feast and famine. You could tell what season it was, not by the light in the sky, but by what you were chewing. If it was soft and sweet, summer. If it was frozen and vaguely regrettable, winter. The body became a calendar, long before anyone carved one into bone. In summer, abundance arrived suddenly and without manners. Rivers pulsed with fish, herds moved like living clouds, and berries set the ground on fire. It was chaos, glorious, edible chaos. Everyone gorged, not out of greed, but strategy. Fat had to be stored in both body and cash before the land folded back into silence. The Sami chased reindeer migrations, the Inuit fished until their hands split from cold water, and every family filled the air with smoke from drying racks. For a few shimmering weeks, survival felt almost decadent. Then came winter, dragging its own diet of restraint and ritual. Stored fat became sacred currency, and each mouthful was a decision. Meals shrank to essentials, a ladle of broth, a strip of dried meat, a spoon of oil. People learned to live within hunger's rhythm, never full, never empty, just balanced on that delicate line between enough and memory. Eating too much too soon wasn't indulgence, it was a death sentence. You couldn't feast in January if you wanted to see April. It was, in its own harsh way, a form of ecological intelligence. The body wasn't an individual organism, but part of the seasonal system, storing sunlight in fat, releasing it through motion, conserving energy when the world turned dark. People didn't plan meals, they synchronized metabolism with the planet's tilt. Their biology kept time with the solstice. And when the seasons shifted, the rituals shifted with them. The first seal hunt wasn't just food gathering, it was a ceremony of renewal. The first berry harvest meant the sun had forgiven the world again. The thaw of meat pit signaled a return to life. Each event marked a page in the body's unwritten almanac. This rhythm wasn't romantic. It was exhausting, but it worked. Generations survived by obeying hunger's clock. They learned that abundance has to be paid for with fasting, and fasting earns the right to abundance. In that eternal pendulum, people found meaning, or at least consistency, which is the next best thing when you're surrounded by snow and silence. It's strange how even now, when refrigerators hum and supermarkets glow, our bodies remember those cycles. Modern hunger pangs are just echoes, faint reminders of a time when we didn't eat for pleasure, but for prophecy. Because in the Arctic, hunger wasn't a punishment. It was a season, and like every season, it passed, leaving behind its own quiet philosophy that survival depends not on constant fullness, but on the patience to wait for the next thaw. And when that thaw came, and the air softened again, it wasn't just food that returned, it was choice, temptation, and the dangerous art of knowing when not to eat. If modern life is about abundance, Arctic life was about restraint, the kind that could kill you if you got it wrong. Controlled scarcity wasn't just a habit, it was an institution. Imagine running an economy where your main currency, fat, meat, light, was constantly melting. Every decision about eating was a small act of governance, a negotiation with both your stomach and the season. In this frozen republic of hunger, overeating was rebellion, and waste was blasphemy. Families rationed every scrap of seal oil, every shard of dried fish, as carefully as scribes copying sacred texts. There were rules, unspoken, unbreakable, about when to open the cache, how much to take, and who had earned the right to take it. The smallest indulgence could tilt the social balance. Too much generosity meant starvation later. Too little, and you risked spiritual punishment, or worse, public shame. Scarcity bred ethics. You learned to measure not just portions, but character. Hunters who returned empty-handed were fed first, not out of pity, but logic. Keeping the provider alive meant keeping everyone alive. Elders who refused food weren't being noble. They were performing arithmetic. The community was a living equation, and each bowl of soup had to balance it. Even rituals of celebration were rationed performances. During storms, people sometimes cooked their best stores, not to feast, but to calm the weather. It was a trade between humans and the cosmos. Burn a little fat now, earn the sun's mercy later. The Chukchi, the Yupik, and the Sami all had variations of this belief, that restraint pleased the world more than excess. The Arctic, after all, was allergic to greed. To outsiders, this all looked grim. But it had an elegance, a rhythm of denial that turned necessity into wisdom. Food became an instrument of time management, of morality, even of diplomacy. When one family shared their fermented soup with another, they weren't just filling bellies. They were reinforcing trust, creating a debt that could last generations. Scarcity, ironically, created abundance of loyalty, of reputation, of meaning. And there was something almost philosophical in the way they spoke about hunger. It wasn't an enemy to be conquered, but a companion to be understood. A person who could sit calmly in hunger was considered strong, spiritually and socially. To endure without panic, to postpone gratification. To make silence your supper, that was Arctic mindfulness before anyone started selling it. Of course, there were moments of indulgence, rare, luminous feasts, where everyone ate until logic dissolved and laughter echoed off the snow. But even those were temporary, followed by days of deliberate, quiet eating, restoring balance. The community exhaled, then tightened its belt again. That constant push and pull, giving, withholding, waiting, shaped more than boaties. It shaped belief. It taught that control wasn't denial but devotion, that the greatest luxury was not abundance, but endurance. Because in a land where everything is limited, the only real excess worth having is discipline. And discipline, as it turns out, was also the domain of those who managed the invisible side of survival, the keepers of fermentation, preservation, and caution, the women and elders who made sure that hunger never turned into despair. Every Arctic household had its scientists, and almost all of them were women, not the kind with beakers or titles, but the kind who could tell the exact age of fermented fish just by inhaling near it. In societies where survival depended on chemistry, intuition, and nerve, women and elders held the quiet power of both. They knew when meat was safe, when blubber had turned to poison, and how long you could push hunger before the human body began to eat itself. Their kitchen wasn't a kitchen. It was a laboratory made of stone, snow, and instinct. They didn't read temperatures. They read the air. They didn't measure salt. They tasted the wind. A Sami woman stirring reindeer stew could predict an incoming storm by how fast the fat separated. An Inuit grandmother could diagnose a spoiled seal cache from half a kilometer away. They didn't call it expertise, but entire communities lived or died by it. Fermentation was their domain, and with it came both respect and risk. The fine line between preservation and botulism wasn't drawn with ink, it was drawn with experience, often paid for in funerals. Women inherited this sensory map through memory, a smell, a color, a feeling in the fingertips. Recipes weren't taught, they were absorbed. A child learned when to stir, when to wait, when to trust her nose over her hunger. Knowledge aged like the food itself, quietly, beautifully, and always on the edge of danger. Elders, meanwhile, acted as edible historians. They remembered which winter froze deeper, which year the river thawed too soon, which family's cache turned sour. Their stories weren't written in words but in warnings. Don't bury fish there. The ground breathes too warm. Don't mix moss from the north side of the hill. It drinks the wrong water. Each instruction was a line of code in an unwritten encyclopedia of survival. And it wasn't all solemn wisdom. There was humor too, the kind that comes from long winters and near-death experiences. Old women teased young hunters for bringing back scrawny seals, muttering that even the gods wouldn't ferment such disappointment. Elders would laugh about the legendary batch of fish that once exploded under someone's bed, turning an entire hut into an olfactory crime scene. They found comedy in rot, grace in decay, and authority in the smell of success. Anthropologists later tried to map this knowledge with clipboards and thermometers. They failed, of course, because what these women knew wasn't quantifiable. It was embodied. It lived in the muscles, the senses, and the years spent listening to the world ferment. They didn't just preserve food, they preserved knowledge, stability, and dignity. In a landscape that punished mistakes instantly, they built continuity out of caution. When younger generations drifted toward canned goods and imported sugar, it was often the grandmothers who resisted first. They understood that forgetting how to ferment was forgetting how to survive. Food safety, for them, wasn't bureaucracy, it was sacred literacy, an ancient correspondence between human patience and bacterial generosity. So, while the hunters filled the caches and the gods decided the weather, it was women and elders who quietly kept the species alive, one careful sniff at a time. And from their hands came not just preservation, but something deeper, a spiritual etiquette of eating, where every bite required respect, not just for the food, but for the life that gave it. To eat in the Arctic wasn't simply consumption, it was negotiation. Every bite required permission. Every hunt, every meal, every mouthful of seal oil carried a moral signature, a promise to the world that nothing would be wasted, and everything taken would be honored. Food wasn't property, it was part of an ongoing conversation with the unseen. Among the Inuit, a seal wasn't just an animal, it was a being with agency, capable of withholding itself from ungrateful hunters. The act of eating seal meat was therefore an agreement, a renewal of trust. If the hunter disrespected the catch, the sea goddess Sedna could revoke her generosity. Similar logic echoed across northern peoples. The Chukchi, the Sami, the Awenki, all carried the understanding that food wasn't earned by strength, but granted through balance. This unwritten law shaped everything, from table manners to theology. Before carving meat, some touched their knives to their foreheads in thanks. Children were taught to feed the fire or leave a morsel for the spirits of the hunt. Hunters whispered apologies to carcasses, wiping their hands clean not to sanitize, but to symbolically release the animal's soul. It was a moral ecosystem, part biology, part metaphysics, that kept arrogance from collapsing the food chain. To modern ears, this might sound sentimental, but it was pure ecological logic, dressed in myth. In regions where a single whale could feed a village for months, the line between survival and sacrilege was razor-thin. Greed wasn't just socially punished, it was cosmically discouraged. A careless act, an insult to the animal's spirit, could mean failed hunts, storms, or sickness. The world, in short, had a feedback system, and it was very responsive. And yet there was something profoundly tender about this arrangement. Gratitude wasn't performative, it was procedural. People didn't just thank the gods after eating, they thanked the seal for showing up, the wind for guiding it, the ice for holding long enough to catch it. Even leftovers were handled with ceremony. The remains of bones were placed carefully back into the sea or onto the snow, so their souls could return and be reborn. It was recycling before the concept existed, sanctified by awe. Feasts were never about indulgence. They were renewals of the social contract with the world. The first bite belonged to the spirits, the last to the dogs, who bridged the human and animal realms. To eat was to participate in a sacred choreography, one that linked flesh, flame, and fate. Ironically, this spirituality wasn't abstract, it was grounded, literally. The Arctic didn't allow distance between belief and biology. If you disrespected your food, you might simply run out of it. The world had no room for hypocrisy. And perhaps that's the most haunting part, the understanding that survival was a moral act. You didn't live because you were clever. You lived because the world allowed it. It's an unnerving thought that even the most basic act of eating was a kind of prayer. But in the Arctic, prayer wasn't about faith, it was about feedback. And while the gods handled the balance of the cosmos, the human body quietly mirrored it, becoming a living storehouse of energy, warmth, and survival. holding within it the very landscape it depended on. Before refrigerators, before even the idea of extra, the only reliable pantry in the Arctic was your own flesh. The body itself became the storehouse, soft, silent, and biochemical. Fat wasn't just energy, it was foresight. To gain weight was to prepare for scarcity, to build internal insurance against the next long, white silence. The Arctic body was both eater and storage unit, consuming in the present to survive the absence of the future. Seasonal weight changes weren't vanity's concern, they were survival's choreography. In the brief summer months, when fish and berries flooded the tundra, people ate until their bodies remembered. Layers of blubber, muscle, and glycogen quietly accumulated, turning humans into their own emergency reserves. When winter returned, the body cached those reserves slowly, burning through stored sunlight while the outside world slept beneath snow. It was metabolism as mythology, the belief that warmth could be eaten and worn at once. Every culture north of the tree line knew this balance intuitively. Sami herders joked that a good reindeer fattened like its owner, meaning at the right pace, with dignity. Inuit hunters measured endurance, not by strength, but by softness, the capacity to endure hunger without panic. In an environment that punished waste, fat was virtue. A plump child was a triumph of community effort. A lean elder was not a failure but a calculation, a sign of sacrifice, of fat given back to the next generation. Science, centuries late, as usual, later confirmed what intuition already knew. Arctic metabolism had adapted to process immense amounts of fat efficiently. High-fat diets, genetic variants, and unique gut flora allowed people to extract every possible calorie, every molecule of warmth. In other words, nature had turned them into self-regulating furnaces. They didn't just store food, they became food. Metabolically speaking, walking proof that survival is simply well-organized consumption. But there was something almost poetic in how the body mirrored the land. During summer, it expanded like the rivers, storing energy in motion. During winter, it contracted, conserving heat, the way the sun hoarded light below the horizon. People didn't separate themselves from the landscape. They followed its rhythm, keeping time through the expansion and deflation of their own forms. The Arctic didn't just demand resilience, it sculpted it. Even language reflected this intimacy. Among some northern peoples, to feed oneself and keep the spirit strong were the same phrase. Food wasn't external, it was identity replenished. The act of eating wasn't simply adding mass, it was reaffirming belonging, the body literally shaped by the land it consumed. Each gram of fat, each cell warmed by whale oil, was a quiet affirmation that the world still recognized you as part of its cycle. Modernity, of course, arrived and declared all this barbaric. Fat became a sin, restraint a virtue. But in the Arctic, leanness had always meant danger. The ideal body was not the fragile sculpture of self-denial, but a full, steady vessel capable of lasting through the months when the sky forgot the sun. Because in the north, the body wasn't a temple. It was a storage unit, practical, portable, and blessedly warm. And when colonial ships brought their tins of sugar and bags of white flour, they didn't just change the menu. They broke the contract between body and landscape, rewriting metabolism faster than culture could catch up. Then came the tins, the flour, the syrup. Civilization, with all its shiny promises and invisible consequences, arrived neatly packed in wooden crates. And just like that, millennia of perfect metabolic choreography began to unravel. The colonizers didn't just bring religion and rifles, they brought sugar, and that turned out to be the more dangerous weapon. For Arctic communities, whose diets had been forged by famine and refined by fermentation, this new food was nutritional sabotage disguised as progress. The imported diet of white flour, salt pork, and sweetened tea hit bodies that had evolved to run on seal oil and fish fat, like a car filled with the wrong fuel. Scurvy, which had been nearly eliminated through fermented meat and berries, returned with missionary zeal. Diabetes, once unknown in the Arctic, spread within decades. The colonizers blamed genetics, of course, as if the land itself had suddenly become defective, not the food dumped upon it. Missionaries banned uncivilized dishes like fermented seal or raw whale skin, declaring them unholy or unhygienic. Entire generations grew up believing that the very foods which had sustained their ancestors were primitive, shameful, even dangerous. Children who once learned from grandmothers how to read the smell of fermenting fish were now being taught the Lord's Prayer in exchange for sugar cubes. Tradition was not just suppressed, it was metabolically erased. The irony was biblical. The same people who'd mocked rotting seal meat for centuries now shipped canned soup to the Arctic, sterile, tasteless, and nutritionally useless. A diet that once tuned the body to the environment was replaced by one that dulled it. Fat, once sacred, was replaced by syrup. Balance became addiction. Even language changed. Words for old preservation techniques fell out of use, replaced by imports like store-bought and rations. Anthropologists writing in the 20th century described this as nutritional transition. That's the academic way of saying people started dying differently. Not from cold or hunger, from abundance. Tooth decay became epidemic. Obesity, heart disease, and vitamin deficiencies appeared side by side, grotesquely united under the banner of civilization. It wasn't a transition. It was a collapse disguised as convenience. Yet through it all, fragments of the old wisdom survived, whispered, hidden, fermented quietly in corners. Some families continued to bury meat in secret, calling it old style. Some elders refused to give up seal oil, declaring that the stomach remembers what's true. They were right. The human body doesn't forget a few thousand years of fine-tuned adaptation just because someone built a supermarket. And in the late 20th century, when science finally caught up, it discovered what the grandmothers already knew, that fermented Arctic foods were not primitive at all, but nutritionally superior to nearly everything colonialism offered. Probiotics, omega-3s south, antioxidants, the buzzwords of wellness marketing, were just polite translations of what the ancestors ate. Still, the damage lingered, not just in bodies, but in self-perception. Food had become a moral battlefield. The shame of smelling like seal against the pride of eating like your grandmother. The colonial diet had stripped the Arctic of its balance, and with it, its memory. But as the century turned, and the old recipes resurfaced, so did something deeper, a kind of edible defiance. A return to the microbial gods who never stopped working, even when everyone forgot their names. And so, the modern Arctic began to rediscover its oldest science, that food, if respected, could resurrect more than just health. It could resurrect identity. What's remarkable about the Arctic isn't just that people survived the cold, it's that their recipes did. After a century of nutritional colonization and industrial noise, the old ways began to thaw back to life. You could almost say fermentation had been waiting patiently underground, biding its time, like a buried cache of wisdom sealed in ice. Across the north, from Nunavut to northern Norway, families began reviving ancestral preservation methods once dismissed as backward. Young people learned to ferment fish again, to render fat, to gather cloudberries that didn't come from plastic tubs. Scientists, the very same type who once lectured Arctic women about food safety, now arrived with notebooks, realizing these so-called primitive methods had done something modern chemistry still struggled with: preserve nutrition perfectly, indefinitely, and sustainably. Fermented foods, once scorned as symbols of poverty, re-emerged as symbols of resistance. Kifiak, igunak, muktuk, even the sharp-smelling berry soups, once banned by colonial health officers, all returned to the table. They weren't nostalgia, they were reclamation. Each bite was a political act, disguised as dinner, a quiet insistence that survival didn't need permission. Communities launched food sovereignty projects, blending ancestral skill with contemporary science. In Greenland, families built communal freezers next to traditional fermentation pits, a merging of generations, microbes, and electricity. In northern Canada, Inuit nutritionists began teaching fermentation workshops that felt more like ceremonies than classes. People weren't just learning how to store food again, they were learning how to belong again. The revival went deeper than diet. It was cultural recalibration. To eat fermented seal was to reclaim the rhythm of patience, to trust in invisible work, to listen to bacteria instead of advertisements. It was, in a way, an act of humility, a reminder that life persists best when left to its own slow intelligence. And the irony, as always, was rich. The global wellness industry, meanwhile, began selling Arctic probiotics and Nordic diets to city dwellers who would faint at the smell of iguana. The world that once sneered at Arctic fermentation now packaged its wisdom in minimalist jars and sold it for €40. Civilization had circled back, spoon in hand, to to taste what it once tried to erase. But for the people who never forgot, the revival wasn't about irony. It was about continuity, the quiet, bacterial heartbeat of a world that refused to die. Fermentation, freezing, and fat weren't just techniques. They were philosophy made edible. They taught that decay can be preservation, that patience can feed nations, and that memory sometimes smells a little strong, but it keeps you alive. So, as the wind still howls across tundras and the snow erases the footprints of every generation, the Arctic table endures, heavy with blubber, berries, and stories. The soup still bubbles softly in the dark. The berries still glow under frost. The fat still burns like candlelight in the belly. And somewhere, an old woman tastes the air above a seal oil pot, smiles faintly, and says, "It's ready." Because even now, at the edge of the world, survival remains what it's always been, a collaboration between hunger, patience, and rot. Humanity, for most of its existence, lived on the edge of an empty plate. Hunger wasn't a crisis then. It was the daily background noise of existence. People didn't eat 3 meals a day. They ate when something stopped running long enough to be caught. And strangely, that absence, that quiet interval between meals, became the most reliable survival mechanism evolution ever engineered. The body, faced with nothing, learned how to make everything last. What looks like deprivation from the modern perspective was, biologically speaking, maintenance. Early humans didn't have snack drawers. They had metabolism, a remarkable trick that could downshift into austerity mode whenever nature closed the kitchen. Cells learned to repair themselves under stress, to recycle damaged material, to conserve energy with the discipline of a monk. Anthropologists call it adaptation. Biologists call it autophagy. Ancient people probably just called it a bad week. The irony, of course, is that starving a little made them stronger, while modern life celebrates abundance. Breakfast, brunch, late-night fries. The ancestors thrived precisely because they couldn't. Periods of hunger reduced inflammation. Balanced hormones sharpened the mind. People became lean, alert, efficient, the evolutionary equivalent of running on eco mode. It wasn't a lifestyle. It was natural selection with a sense of humor. The ones who panicked and ate everything at once usually didn't make it to winter. Archaeological remains whisper the same story. Hunter-gatherer bones show fewer signs of the metabolic diseases that plague modern societies. Their arteries stayed clear. Their joints didn't swell. Their lifespans, though shorter overall, weren't cut down by excess. They were ended by lions, cliffs, or sheer statistical misfortune. If they made it past those hazards, their bodies aged with the rhythm of people who understood one simple truth. Survival is about intervals, not indulgence. And culturally, hunger wasn't always fearsome. It taught rhythm, patience, and awareness. Entire mythologies were built around fasting, waiting, earning the next meal. Hunger wasn't an absence but a teacher, one that revealed where you stood in the cosmic food chain. The Sand People of southern Africa, for instance, spoke of the stomach's wisdom, a phrase that today would probably be printed on yoga mats, but originally meant, "Don't eat everything now, idiot, the dry season's coming." Modernity, of course, broke that cycle. Refrigeration and agriculture turned survival into constant access, and constant access turned the body into a confused museum of excess. The systems designed for feast and famine now find themselves trapped in endless feast, a biological prank of cosmic proportions. The mitochondria still expect a bad hunting week that never comes, and they're getting cranky about it. It's strange to think of hunger as a luxury now, something you pay for in juice cleanses and spiritual retreats. The body, though, remembers. It remembers the long silences between meals, the metabolic poetry of deprivation. It remembers that less, for thousands of years, meant living longer, clearer, lighter. And it's from that evolutionary memory, that beautiful, ironic balance between emptiness and endurance, that another kind of calendar was born. One written not on paper but in hunger itself. Long before anyone carved months into stone or invented the idea of summer vacation, time was measured in stomachs. The year didn't begin with a date, it began with the first growl of collective hunger. Fasting wasn't an event, it was the calendar itself. the San in southern Africa, the Nenets in Siberia, the Ainu in Hokkaido, all lived by the same ticking clock of appetite and absence. When food ran thin, people didn't fight it. They folded into it, trusting that the body, like the sun, knew when to return. It was a rhythm the land itself dictated. Spring brought roots and insects, summer spilled berries and fattened animals, and winter stripped everything bare. You didn't resist those cycles. You synchronized with them. The concept of seasonal eating wasn't lifestyle branding, it was thermodynamic obedience. The hunter's pulse followed the migration of herds. The gatherer's digestion matched the thaw of moss. The act of fasting wasn't punishment or holiness. It was scheduling, the original biological calendar invite. Anthropologists studying Paleolithic remains have noted the telltale signs of rhythmic deprivation. Bone density dips seasonally, matching food scarcity patterns. Even teeth, those tiny historians of stress, record lean periods like rings in a tree. And yet, despite this regular hardship, early humans adapted beautifully. Their bodies used fasting the way forests use winter, to shed waste, to rest, to prepare. Scarcity became regeneration. It's amusing, in a bleak way, that modern humans pay for this experience now. Intermittent fasting, they call it, as though skipping breakfast could recreate 100,000 years of elegant starvation. Meanwhile, foragers once turned hunger into art. The Hadza of Tanzania still fast naturally through long dry seasons, walking for hours before eating, their metabolisms humming in quiet agreement with the earth's tempo. They don't write books about it. They just don't die of inflammation. But the seasonal fast was more than biology, it was moral architecture. When food was scarce, greed became visible, gluttony fatal. Sharing during famine built alliances stronger than kinship. Hunger made social cohesion practical. One hunter's success became everyone's survival. Eating together was how people kept time, but not eating together was how they remembered the year's harder lessons. Even the earliest agriculturalists changed their crops, inherited this rhythm. The ancient Egyptians timed their festivals to the Nile's flood and its retreat. One season of excess, one of emptiness. Grain ran out just before the new harvest, forcing a ritual fast that, over generations, transformed into religion. The body, as always, made the best theologian. There's a strange peace in that pattern, a kind of fatalistic grace. You can almost imagine the hush of a pre-dawn camp, the faint smell of smoke, the slow awareness that today there will be no meal. And yet, no panic, just an ancient confidence that this emptiness, too, is temporary. Because the hunger wasn't meaningless, it was metronomic. It kept everything, metabolism, morality, memory, in sync. And just as the earth relied on winter to prepare for bloom, the body relied on fasting to renew itself before the next inevitable feast. In that sense, the oldest calendar wasn't written in stars or stone, it was written in hunger. And it laid the groundwork for something even more peculiar, turning necessity into ritual, and restraint into sacred law. At some point, humans did what they always do. They took a survival strategy and turned it into religion. Fasting, once just the polite thing to do when there was nothing to eat, became sacred. Civilizations began ritualizing hunger, wrapping it in incense and theology, as if the gods themselves had personally approved of eating less. And in a way, maybe they had after all. Restraint kept their worshippers alive long enough to keep praying. Ancient Egypt, for example, treated fasting as both purification and politics. Priests abstained before ceremonies, not because of moral virtue, but because empty stomachs looked better under linen. Greek philosophers did the same, calling it discipline of the soul, when in truth, it made them less bloated while thinking about metaphysics. Pythagoras insisted that students fasted before learning geometry, perhaps hoping they'd be too light-headed to argue. Even Hippocrates recommended fasting to heal the body, long before modern medicine rediscovered that starving cells sometimes fix themselves better than doctors can. Across India, restraint became an architectural principle of faith. Vedic ascetics perfected, controlled hunger as a ladder to the divine. The idea that each skipped meal was a rung closer to transcendence. In Buddhism, the body was trained like an instrument, silenced the appetite, tuned the mind. Jain monks took it furthest, fasting until they nearly vanished, believing that less flesh meant more spirit. They weren't wrong about the biology. Fasting does heighten mental clarity. They just applied it with a bit too much enthusiasm. In early Christianity, fasting took on a moral tone, an edible form of penance. Lent, Advent, countless saintly vigils, all organized around the ancient idea that self-denial nourishes something more important than muscle. Medieval monasteries turned it into a schedule. Hunger at dawn, prayer by noon, enlightenment by sundown, with maybe a turnip in between. It wasn't just deprivation, it was moral currency. The less you ate, the more spiritual interest you accrued. But there was a practical side too. By transforming scarcity into ritual, societies made famine survivable. A religious fast looked better than a shortage. Calling it holy kept panic away. When the granaries emptied, rulers proclaimed purification, a brilliant public relations strategy disguised as theology. The gods demand it, they'd say, while quietly waiting for the next shipment of grain. Hunger became manageable when it was meaningful. And beneath all this sanctified self-control lay a quiet biological truth. People who ate less often lived longer, not because of divine reward, but because fasting naturally repaired the body. Ritualized hunger, cloaked in divine language, was just evolution dressed in robes. The gods got credit for what mitochondria were already doing. There's something endearingly human about that, turning metabolism into mysticism. People didn't understand why restraint worked, but they could feel that it did. The mind cleared, the senses sharpened, and the noise of existence softened into stillness. Hunger, ironically, became the sound of peace. And as these sacred economies of food spread, another logic began to form, one not about holiness, but about ecology. Because restraint, it turned out, didn't just save souls, it saved landscapes. Every ecosystem, if left alone long enough, teaches the same lesson. Take too much, and everything dies, usually you first. Long before climate conferences and biodegradable straws, traditional societies had already mastered sustainability through hunger. Not because they were idealists, but because overeating was ecologically suicidal. Eating less meant not stripping the world bare. It was conservation disguised as common sense. In small subsistence-based communities, restraint was environmental law. The Sami herders of the Arctic rotated their grazing grounds with mathematical precision, ensuring no tundra patch was overfed upon. The Hadza of Tanzania hunted just enough for the day, leaving pregnant animals untouched. Pacific Island fishers refused to cast nets during spawning season, calling it taboo, a spiritual word for we'd like to keep existing. Every culture had its vocabulary of abstinence, and every abstinence doubled as a conservation policy. Food taboos often sounded arbitrary to outsiders. No shellfish on Fridays, no hunting deer in spring, no picking certain plants under a full moon. But anthropologists later discovered the pattern. These weren't mystical rules, but ecological algorithms. They limited consumption at critical moments in nature's cycle, giving herds time to breed and fields time to recover. People obeyed the cosmos because the cosmos fed them. It wasn't morality. It was long-term menu planning. Even the idea of forbidden foods, the pig for ancient Hebrews, the cow for Hindus, carried practical logic hidden beneath divine theater. In harsh, pre-refrigeration climates, those animals were expensive to maintain, disease-prone, or vital to agriculture. Declaring them sacred or unclean was simply public health, written in theology. And while prophets and priests got the credit, it was really bacteria doing the heavy lifting. Restraint kept ecosystems breathing. Periods of fasting weren't just good for people. They gave land, rivers, and herds a break. Communities that didn't learn moderation vanished, leaving behind ghost settlements and overgrazed fields, early warnings carved in bone. In contrast, those that wove restraint into ritual thrived for centuries, proving that ecology doesn't need prophets, just timing and humility. There's something hauntingly elegant about that. The way ancient hunger kept everything in balance without spreadsheets or satellites. The line between biology and ethics blurred entirely. To eat too much wasn't just greed, it was treason against the soil. Even now, in some Arctic communities, elders scold over eating as if it personally insults the weather. And in a way, it does. Modern civilization, of course, forgot this balance the moment it industrialized dinner. Fields became factories, oceans became warehouses, and abundance became the new apocalypse. We began consuming as though the planet were a buffet with infinite refills, a tragic misunderstanding of portion sizes. But in the long arc of human history, it's restraint that lasted. The communities that learned to fast, share, and rotate lived long enough to pass on their stories. Those that didn't left us deserts and cautionary ruins. It's ironic, really, how the wisdom of restraint, once born from hunger and ecology, now returns as a scientific revelation. Because while the ancients fasted to please the gods or the weather, they were also unknowingly triggering something microscopic and magnificent inside themselves. The body's built-in repair system that thrives on emptiness. Here's the cosmic punchline. All that spiritual self-denial, all those centuries of fasting monks, cautious foragers, and ritual hunger. It worked, but not because the gods were pleased. It worked because the body quietly rewarded them for suffering. Hunger, it turns out, is the most ancient medicine, one that doesn't come in pills but in pauses. The mechanism is as poetic as it is cruel. When deprived of food, the body enters what biologists now call hormesis, the paradox where mild stress makes you stronger. Cells, faced with scarcity, start cleaning house. They recycle damaged parts, burn old fuel, repair DNA, and rewire themselves to survive. It's as if every cell becomes a tiny philosopher under pressure, learning to want less and think clearly. And it's beautiful in a grim sort of way, a body made sharper by lack. Ancient people didn't need a name for it, they saw it in practice. The hunter who went hungry before a chase was quicker, calmer, his senses dialed to perfection. The old woman who rationed her food through long winters often outlived her well-fed neighbors. Even now, in populations like the Okinawans of Japan, where elders still follow the Hirahachi-bu rule, eating until they're 80% full, lifespans stretch far beyond global averages. They're not chasing immortality. They're just not chasing snacks. There's something almost mischievous about biology's design. The same deprivation that feels like death actually prevents it. Fasting lowers insulin, resets hormones, triggers brain-derived growth factors, a symphony of repair disguised as discomfort. The body, apparently, loves being under pressure, as long as it's the right kind. Modern humans, stuffed with calories and convenience, have forgotten this secret rhythm, which is why science keeps discovering what the hungry already knew. Hunger's benefits went beyond the physical. Anthropologists note that fasting often induced altered states, clarity, euphoria, visions, the shaman's trance, the monk's revelation, the prophet's desert dialogue. All could be traced to the neurochemical poetry of a starving brain. Ketones rise, dopamine balances, serotonin dances, the spirit soars mostly because the stomach's empty. Enlightenment, it seems, was a side effect of efficient metabolism. It's hard not to admire the irony. Modern life tries to buy longevity through supplements, gym memberships, and superfoods, when the oldest, cheapest method was simply, stop eating for a while. Our ancestors achieved cellular renewal with nothing but willpower and a lack of mammoths, and this, too, fed back into culture. Hunger became the rhythm of existence, a hum between feast and famine that shaped philosophy, ecology, and now, biology. To live too comfortably was unnatural. The body needed stress the way the earth needs winter. Without it, everything rots from abundance. So while modern science dissects the chemistry of fasting, it's really just naming an ancient instinct, the quiet knowledge that the body, like a fire, burns brightest when tended carefully, not constantly. But hunger's lessons weren't just personal. They reshaped entire societies. Because while biology loved fasting for cellular repair, culture used it to define who controlled the food and who didn't. Hunger, for all its biological wisdom, was never distributed equally. The irony of human civilization is that the moment we grew enough food for everyone, we invented hierarchies to make sure everyone didn't get it. From the first city-states onward, who ate and how much became the quiet language of power. Kings feasted, peasants fasted, and both thought it was divine will. Archaeologists can read this imbalance straight from skeletons. In Mesopotamia and early China, upper-class remains show gout, obesity, and dental decay, the perks of uninterrupted access. Meanwhile, peasants' bones tell a different story: lean muscle, low inflammation, the occasional rib fracture from hard labor, but arteries clean enough to make modern cardiologists weep. The rich died fat and praised by poets. The poor died old and ignored. Civilization, in that sense, was just organized overeating. Ancient doctors noticed, Egyptian scrolls already warned that excess meat and beer clogged the body's channels, advice politely ignored by every pharaoh who ever lived. In the imperial courts of China, physicians begged their emperors to eat less, not for morality, but survival. Eat half, live double, one medical text advised. The emperors responded by inventing banquets that lasted 3 days. The peasants, of course, just called that Tuesday without food. But hunger wasn't just a symptom of poverty, it was a tool of control. Grain storage, taxation, and famine management formed the backbone of early governments. A ruler's real power wasn't in soldiers, but in surplus, deciding who starved and when. Famine could dethrone an empire faster than any rebellion. And yet, the same scarcity that killed millions also disciplined entire populations. Hunger was the original bureaucracy. Religion joined the hierarchy too, conveniently sanctifying the order. Feasting became divine right. Fasting, divine duty. Kings offered sacrifices while their subjects offered silence. Even within monasteries, those supposed havens of equality, fasting turned competitive, with ascetics vying for holiness through emaciation. Somewhere between survival and sanctity, the human appetite was drafted into politics. Anthropologists still marvel at the paradox. The very thing that prolonged life restraint was imposed on those least able to choose it. The wealthy could afford moderation as an aesthetic. The poor practiced it involuntarily, yet evolution played favorites. Over generations, scarcity sculpted the genes of the underfed, selecting for endurance, fat storage, metabolic efficiency. The poor, quite literally, adapted to outlive their masters. It's biology's most satisfying act of revenge. And through it all, hunger became an identity. To fast was to be humble, to endure was to be strong, and to share was to be human. Across continents, those who lived closer to emptiness tended to live longer, not because they wanted less, but because they had to. Civilizations rose, fell, and feasted themselves into oblivion, while small communities, quietly rationing in the corners of empire, persisted. It's strange to think that the secret of longevity might have always belonged to those at the bottom of the food chain, but perhaps it makes sense. The ones who learned to live with less never had much to lose, except, ironically, death itself. And somewhere in that thin space between necessity and spirituality, hunger took on another function entirely, not political, not ecological, but visionary. Because the emptier the stomach, the louder the mind began to speak. There's a peculiar threshold where biology tips into mysticism, the point at which hunger stops being just a bodily ache and starts rearranging perception. For early humans, that threshold was familiar territory. Long before scientists spoke of dopamine regulation or altered neurochemistry, prophets, shamans, and hermits discovered that an empty stomach could open strange doors in the mind. Not eating, somehow, made the world brighter, louder, more precise, and perhaps, more bearable. Across continents, cultures learned to court that emptiness. The San of the Kalahari danced for days without food, entering trances they called where pain, exhaustion, and hunger braided into transcendence. The Siberian Ewenki fasted before rituals to thin the body, making it porous enough for spirits to enter. Christian hermits wandered deserts in deliberate deprivation, hallucinating angels who often sounded suspiciously like dehydration. Hunger sharpened reality until it split, and what spilled through was mistaken or understood as revelation. Modern physiology, ever late to the party, eventually explained it. Fasting triggers a metabolic shift. Glucose dwindles, ketones rise, and the brain, desperate for fuel, begins firing differently. Perception heightens, memory strengthens, and emotion swings between euphoria and despair. The kind of chemical theater mystics have always called communion. Deprive the brain of lunch long enough, and it starts writing poetry about God. But for ancient practitioners, hunger wasn't pathology, it was clarity. Shamans used fasting to prepare for visions, warriors before battle, monks before enlightenment. In all cases, the logic was the same. Silence the stomach, and the rest of you listens better. The noise of appetite dims, and suddenly, you can hear the hum beneath everything. That hum became spirit, cosmos, ancestors, whatever name suited the culture. The phenomenon was universal. Only the metaphors changed. The irony is delicious. The brain's most mystical experiences may have been its emergency responses to starvation. What priests called divine revelation was possibly ketosis. and what prophets described as the voice of heaven may have been serotonin politely losing its grip. But the effect, the sense of transcendence, purpose, connection, was real enough to shape entire religions. Humanity, in a sense, built civilization on low blood sugar. There's a dark humor to it too. The very hunger that tormented people also convinced them they were chosen. History's holiest figures, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, countless ascetics and visionaries, all starved themselves into wisdom. It's as if the body, by threatening death, tricks the mind into seeing eternity. The fewer calories you consume, the closer you apparently get to cosmic truth. Modern neuroscience calls it neurochemical adaptation. Ancient mystics called it the presence of God. Tomato, tomato. And yet, there's something undeniably profound in that state. Not delusion, but lucidity born from reduction. A brain stripped of luxury starts to perceive meaning everywhere, the way a starving person sees food in clouds. It's not madness, it's concentration. Hunger makes the world thin enough to see through. That visionary emptiness left its fingerprints everywhere, in cave paintings, sacred chants, philosophies of renunciation. Humanity discovered meaning in the gap between meals, and when the trances ended, when food returned, the stories of those visions became scripture, myth served with a side of biology. Still, hunger wasn't only a private revelation. It shaped entire societies, binding people together not through abundance but through collective lack. Because when food was scarce, sharing it wasn't generosity, it was law. Civilizations like to brag about monuments, but hunger built sturdier things. In the long history of humanity, it wasn't abundance that kept people alive, it was cooperation under pressure. When food was scarce, selfishness was fatal. The communities that endured famine weren't the ones with the fattest hunters or the best luck. They were the ones that learned to share scarcity like a ceremony. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer groups, from the Inuit to the Kung, from the Hadza to the Australian Pintupi, found a remarkably consistent pattern. Food never truly belonged to the person who caught it. A successful hunter couldn't just drag home a seal and eat it privately. That seal was already social property, its meat parceled out according to intricate rules of kinship, status, and favor. To hoard food was to invite exile, a death sentence in climates where a single meal could mean another sunrise. Hunger, then, was democracy's oldest rehearsal. There was a practical genius to this. Sharing food didn't just nourish others, it stabilized the group. It turned random luck, who caught what, when, into collective insurance. The hunter who feasted one day might go hungry the next, but someone else's kill would sustain him. It was reciprocity disguised as compassion, the same arithmetic that underpins every successful species with opposable thumbs. Even the rituals of gratitude and generosity were survival tools in costume. Among the Inuit, certain pieces of a kill were reserved for specific people, elders, pregnant women, the first-time hunter's teacher. In the Kalahari, the insulting of the meat, mockery, directed at the hunter, prevented arrogance and enforced humility. Everyone participated in the balance. The social contract was simple. No one eats alone, and no one forgets who shared when it mattered. In early agricultural societies, this logic persisted. Seasonal shortages, the so-called hungry months between planting and harvest, forced entire villages into synchronized fasting. These lean times forged empathy more effectively than any sermon. When famine hit, survival wasn't about individual skill, but collective memory. Who had helped? Who had hoarded? Who could be trusted? The anthropology of scarcity is the anthropology of obligation. It's almost poetic that the worst conditions produced the best manners. Scarcity made people polite. Abundance, historically, made them intolerable. The wealthy could afford to forget gratitude. The hungry couldn't. They remembered every piece of shared bread, every silent kindness disguised as rationing. In the Arctic, there's still a word, ixtuapok, for the anxious anticipation of someone arriving with food. It describes not hunger itself, but hope, sharpened by cold and community. In that way, famine became a kind of invisible architect of morality. It taught fairness, timing, cooperation. Every bowl passed around the fire wasn't just charity, it was architecture, scaffolding for society itself. People learned that hunger could dissolve hierarchy, that sharing wasn't virtue but survival mathematics. And yet, as abundance eventually arrived through agriculture, trade, and technology, that ancient etiquette began to fray. Hunger no longer bound people together. It became a stigma, a thing to hide. But the memory lingered, tucked deep in the body's chemistry, in the quiet relief that follows every meal. The stomach, it seems, still remembers communal hunger long after the mind forgets. And perhaps that's why modern excess feels so strangely hollow, because the old balance between lack and life has been replaced by noise. The body still expects famine. The world, unfortunately, keeps serving seconds. At some point, humanity stopped eating to live and started eating to forget. It happened quietly, a few thousand years of agriculture, a few centuries of industry, and then suddenly the species that once starved elegantly was surrounded by too much of everything. The refrigerator replaced the famine, the clock replaced the season, and the stomach, that ancient oracle of rhythm and reason, was silenced by abundance. But the body didn't get the memo. It still carries the memory of millennia spent negotiating with hunger. Metabolism, hormones, even our taste for fat and salt, all evolved for a world that doesn't exist anymore. We were built to endure scarcity, not supermarkets. The biological systems that once protected us now betray us, mistaking constant availability for emergency and stockpiling calories like anxious accountants. Evolution prepared us for famine. Civilization cursed us with all-you-can-eat buffets. Anthropologists sometimes call this the mismatch problem, though that feels too polite. It's more like an ongoing identity crisis. Our genes are still hunter-gatherers, but our habits belong to feudal kings, and the results are grotesquely predictable. Populations that once survived on seasonal fasting now suffer from the exact opposite: continuous feeding. The diseases of excess, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, are really just ancient instincts misfiring in the modern landscape. The body is doing its job too well. The environment is the problem. Even culture forgot the dignity of hunger. What used to be fasting, an act of clarity and renewal, has been rebranded as detox, a guilt-based subscription plan for people who've never missed a meal involuntarily. The irony is exquisite. A species that once prayed for food now prays for appetite control. We diet not to survive famine, but to cosplay it. And yet, beneath all the absurdity, there's a ghost of wisdom. Studies on longevity, from Okinawa to Sardinia, show that the oldest, healthiest people still eat like their ancestors. Small portions, simple foods, long pauses between indulgence. They don't count calories. They count gratitude. It's not nostalgia. It's biology whispering, remember when we used to stop? Even the brain seems nostalgic for emptiness. Neuroscientists have found that mild hunger sharpens cognition, while satiety dulls it, as if the mind itself prefers a bit of longing. Perhaps that's why creativity often blooms under discomfort. The empty stomach isn't just waiting for food, it's listening. There's a quiet tragedy in realizing that abundance, the thing civilization promised as salvation, has made us sicker and slower. The hunter-gatherer's famine cycles once triggered cellular repair. Today, we've replaced those natural rhythms with constant intake, snacks, notifications, content, all feeding the same primitive craving to fill the silence. We've abolished hunger, but not the desire to be fed. Still, the memory of scarcity lingers like an echo in our biology. The body, wise and resentful, still performs its ancient rituals, storing fat for winters that never arrive, repairing itself when the occasional skipped meal fools it into thinking the ice age has returned. It remembers what the mind has forgotten, that survival was never about fullness, but about rhythm, balance, patience. And now, as science rediscovers the benefits of intermittent fasting, autophagy, caloric restriction, all the buzzwords of longevity, we're really just stumbling back into our own ancestry. The lab coats are catching up to the bones. But the rediscovery isn't merely biological. Beneath the science lies something older and quieter, the moral rhythm of eating less, of re-entering harmony with time and self. The modern world may have forgotten the meaning of hunger, but it's beginning to remember the peace that came with it, because the final lesson of all this history is not that we should suffer, but that survival, in its truest form, has always depended on restraint. The world, it seems, is finally starving on purpose again. After a few centuries of worshipping abundance, humanity has begun to circle back, quietly, awkwardly, and with a yoga mat. The latest gospel is intermittent fasting, a sleek, data-driven version of what hunter-gatherers, monks, and bored Neanderthals have been doing since time began. Apps now track what sunlight and instinct used to handle perfectly. It's the modern way of rediscovering ancient logic, one push notification at a time. But behind the trend, something sincere is stirring. Beneath the buzzwords and branding lies a faint recognition that the body knows better than the buffet. People are starting to feel it again, that sharpness after a missed meal, the mental clarity of a stomach not yet sedated. Neuroscientists call it ketone elevation. The rest of us might call it finally being awake. Hunger, once treated as an enemy, is sneaking back as an ally. And in a sense, this isn't innovation at all. It's an act of remembering. The fasting monks of Mount Athos, the ascetics of India, the desert fathers of early Christianity, they all practiced rhythmic deprivation as a way to meet reality unblurred. What they framed as spiritual discipline was also biochemical genius. Modern science, in all its graphs and glowing headlines, has simply learned to quantify holiness. Across the planet, long-lived communities still keep this rhythm effortlessly. In Okinawa, elders stop eating when they're 80% full. Harahachi-bu, moderation turned philosophy. In Sardinia, meals remain small, slow, and social. In the Andes and the Arctic, seasonal fasting still follows the old ecological beat. Eat when the earth allows it. Rest when it doesn't. Everywhere, longevity hides. Hunger hums quietly in the background. It's a strange, beautiful, full circle. The species that once prayed for abundance now prays for emptiness, not out of penance, but fatigue. The constant access, the endless noise, the artificial light, all of it has made fullness unbearable. Skipping a meal feels like a rebellion, a way of hearing the body again. Fasting has become what it always was, the art of pause. The rediscovery of hunger is more than dietary nostalgia. It's cultural repair. When people fast, even briefly, they touch something ancient, that equilibrium between taking and waiting, between control and surrender. It's not about weight or vanity. It's about remembering that life, at its core, is rhythmic. Feast, famine, growth, stillness. The universe has always pulsed that way. The tragedy was forgetting to listen. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. To forget what worked and then rediscover it centuries later, under fluorescent light, with a podcast explaining mitochondria. But still, the truth lands softly. Eating less, living longer, thinking clearer. It was never punishment. It was design. Hunger was never the villain of history. It was the quiet architect shaping bodies, societies, and minds alike. It taught patience to evolution, humility to power, and balance to time itself. So the next time the world pauses between meals, whether by discipline, ritual, or accident, it isn't regression, it's a return, a reunion between flesh and memory, because deep down, every human body still remembers the same ancient secret, that sometimes survival begins not with fullness, but with a little bit of nothing. For most of human history, the world was one long waiting room between meals. Eating wasn't a daily guarantee. It was an event, a brief and often accidental success between long stretches of emptiness. Early humans didn't schedule hunger, they lived inside it. The rhythm of existence was a slow dialogue between body and landscape. Walk, search, fail, try again. When food finally appeared, it wasn't cuisine, it was relief. The archaeological record backs this quiet truth with the cold precision of bone chemistry. Our ancestors' skeletal remains showed telltale signs of intermittent deprivation, growth rings of famine etched into enamel, stress lines from nutritional drought. Hunter-gatherers weren't starving in the tragic, modern sense. They were simply designed for intervals. The body adapted to feast and famine, the way lungs adapt to breath and pause. The waiting was the point. And in that long waiting, endurance was born. Muscles learned to move without fuel, brains learned to think under pressure, and the human species, the softest, least equipped creature in any ecosystem, became the most persistent. The evolutionary trick wasn't speed or strength, it was patience. Persistence hunting, still practiced by some desert peoples, depended entirely on it, chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, while the human jogged steadily behind, fueled by nothing but determination and yesterday's berries. Hunger wasn't an obstacle, it was strategy. Even our biology still remembers the pattern. Modern metabolism carries ancient whispers: fat storage, glucose regulation, cellular repair. all fine-tuned for lives of inconsistency. The body's genius lies in its ability to turn deprivation into maintenance. When fuel ran out, cells recycled themselves, stripped down to essentials, and emerged stronger. It's ironic, really. Evolution's best invention was forced minimalism. The mind adapted to hunger, sharpened it. Anthropologists note that periods of food scarcity often coincide with bursts of innovation, new tools, new hunting strategies, new myths. The brain, slightly deprived, becomes strangely efficient, like a fire that burns hotter when the wood runs low. Early humans didn't create art because they were comfortable. They created it because they were waiting for something to eat. In that sense, the first human stories were hunger stories, not tales of abundance, but of pursuit, endurance, and patience disguised as faith. Myth and biology grew together, teaching that to survive was to wait well. Hunger became the teacher, appetite the curriculum, and the lesson endured. Even as the first fires flickered and villages formed, the world still fed people in irregular, unreliable portions. Every meal, no matter how small, carried the memory of the chase, the reminder that food was never a right, but a reward. That rhythm, the waiting, the rationing, the work before the bite, would shape everything that followed. How people measured time, built community, and even imagined virtue itself. Because the longer the hunger lasted, the more meaning eating acquired. And so, when the first permanent settlements arrived and humans began to farm, that old instinct to wait, to work, to endure, didn't vanish. It simply changed form. The meal remained a struggle, only now it required not just endurance of hunger, but of time. The miracle of food, for most of history, was never that it existed, it was that anyone managed to get it twice in a row. Every meal was a small victory against mathematics. Calories spent chasing or harvesting often rivaled calories gained. People didn't eat 3 times a day. They survived an equation that rarely balanced. For hunter-gatherers, time itself was the first ingredient in any dish. Anthropologists estimate that early humans walked between 10 and 20 kilometers daily in pursuit of food. Hours were spent tracking, digging, scraping, and hoping. A rabbit caught or a tuber found was never just a meal, it was the endpoint of an exhausting narrative. The Hadza of Tanzania still live this arithmetic. 6 hours of searching under relentless heat for enough calories to equal a few mouthfuls of honey or meat. The stomach didn't just digest food, it digested time. Farmers later joined the same struggle, only in slow motion. Agriculture promised abundance, but delivered repetition, a new kind of endurance built on monotony and labor. To plant, wait, and harvest meant enduring entire seasons for a single payoff. Archaeological sites from the Neolithic show skeletal stress from long hours of bending and grinding grain, the first chronic back pain in human history. Civilization, in essence, invented waiting as an occupation, and yet, there was a strange elegance in that slowness. Every step toward nourishment was deliberate. Early humans learned patience from the soil itself, measuring life by the growth of crops, the ripening of fruit, the thaw of spring. Meals weren't events to be anticipated every few hours. They were milestones that marked the turning of the earth. The cost of food extended beyond energy and time. It demanded danger. Hunters faced injuries and predators. Foragers risked poisonous plants or unstable cliffs. Even early farmers gambled entire harvests on whether a misplaced season could erase a year's work. To eat was to wager with fate, a contract renewed daily and signed in sweat. There's an anthropological beauty in that, the idea that the simplest act of consumption was also an endurance test. Food wasn't convenience, it was ritualized exhaustion, and that exhaustion carved itself into human culture. Myths celebrated the chase, prayers begged for harvest, and songs praised the hunt, not for abundance, but for its rarity. Modern humans, sitting in front of glowing screens with pre-sliced fruit, have inherited none of that timing. Our bodies still hum with the old rhythm, the pulse of exertion, anticipation, reward, but the world no longer asks us to earn it. And so, metabolism, built for scarcity and labor, rebels under ease. The same machinery that once fueled marathon hunts now processes convenience food while sitting still. But in the ancient world, endurance wasn't optional. Each bite carried the ghost of distance walked, wood gathered, cold endured. To eat meant to remember what it took to get there, and that memory, that link between patience and nourishment, eventually hardened into something else entirely, a a code of restraint, because endurance wasn't just about surviving hunger anymore. It became about mastering it. Somewhere along the long crawl from survival to civilization, humans did what they always do. They made virtue out of necessity. Hunger, once an unavoidable fact of life, became a test of character. Eating, once a simple act of endurance, turned into a ritual of restraint. What began as scarcity transformed into morality. In the Arctic, hunters abstained from food before a major chase, believing that an empty stomach sharpened the senses and humbled the spirit. Across deserts and rainforests alike, the logic held. To eat too much was to insult the world that fed you. Early religions inherited that same instinct and dressed it in sacred language. The body that endured was seen as holy, the one that indulged, weak. Among Buddhist monks, meals were measured by discipline. Rice, taken in silence, became a meditation on impermanence. In Hindu traditions, fasting was a purification of both flesh and thought, a biological form of prayer. And in early Christianity, appetite was recast as sin, hunger as redemption. Lent, Advent, endless days of abstinence, all borrowed from the old ecological rhythm and rebranded as devotion. Even now, the world's holiest men are remembered for how little they ate. It wasn't all spiritual theater. Anthropologists studying fasting rituals among hunter-gatherers and agrarian societies find consistent physiological benefits: reduced inflammation, heightened awareness, improved survival in famine-prone environments. But people didn't explain it with science, they explained it with balance. The body, like the earth, needed pauses. Too much of anything, food, power, rain, risked collapse. In many places, this idea crystallized into social law. The first bite of every communal meal went to the spirits, the gods, or the dead. Eating before elders was forbidden. Hunters waited for permission to taste their own kill. Across Africa, the Americas, and northern Eurasia, to eat without restraint was to risk cosmic imbalance, to break the invisible contract between human appetite and the landscape's patience. Ironically, the more civilization advanced, the more it forgot how to stop. Rulers dined lavishly, while priests starved on purpose to prove virtue. The wealthy grew heavy under gold and grain, while ascetics carved holiness into their ribs. Humanity divided itself into two diets, indulgence and renunciation, both pretending to be wisdom. Still, the ritual endured for a reason. Fasting, whether by faith or famine, gave meaning to endurance. It reminded people that survival wasn't just about what entered the mouth, but about what didn't. Hunger, managed with grace, became a symbol of control in a world otherwise ruled by uncertainty. To be empty, willingly, was to defy chaos. And beneath all the prayer and philosophy lay a quiet biological truth. The less you ate, the longer you lasted. The ancients didn't know about insulin or metabolism, but they saw what happened. The patient outlived the greedy. Restraint became wisdom because it worked. But even the most disciplined stomach couldn't protect people from the deeper law of nature. That food, like everything else, comes in waves. To live was to ride that rhythm of feast and famine, to adapt not through resistance but through rhythm. And in that endless oscillation between plenty and nothing, humanity learned its most powerful form of endurance, the body's quiet ability to survive the swing. The human body, for all its fragility, is an astonishing improviser. It learned to treat abundance and absence not as disasters, but as alternating seasons in the same cycle. This wasn't luxury biology, it was survival engineering. To live meant to shift gears constantly, to turn scarcity into strategy and plenty into preparation. Anthropologists and physiologists alike have traced this adaptive brilliance through bones, genes, and even mitochondria. The evidence is everywhere. Layers of stored fat in ancient remains, isotopic shifts marking the difference between feast months and famine years. Our ancestors were metabolic contortionists. When food was scarce, their bodies slowed down, conserving energy, recycling proteins, cleaning cellular debris. When food returned, they built back reserves. Every generation inherited this rhythm, carved invisibly into the code of life, a reminder that the body was designed for inconsistency. It's funny, in a dark way, that modern science now calls this metabolic flexibility, as if it were a new fitness trend. In truth, it's just an echo of the oldest dance between body and environment. The San in southern Africa, the Inuit in the Arctic, the Hadza in Tanzania, All lived by the same unwritten rule. You're not supposed to eat the same thing every day, or even every week. Variation wasn't choice, it was reality. The stomach became an archivist of the landscape, sometimes filled with berries, sometimes with air. Feast and famine weren't opposites, they were partners in a cycle that trained the body to endure both. After a big hunt, tribes would gorge, not out of greed, but gratitude, knowing the emptiness would return soon enough. The next morning, hunger wasn't a crisis. It was the quiet continuation of life's rhythm. Anthropologists studying the Hadza still observe this easy acceptance of fluctuation, a kind of metabolic faith that the world, chaotic as it was, would eventually provide. The endurance this rhythm produced was profound. Fat wasn't vanity, it was foresight. Stored energy became insulation against both weather and waiting. Even now, in extreme environments, traditional peoples maintain higher tolerance for fasting. Their metabolisms adapted to long hours, sometimes days, between substantial meals. Their endurance wasn't built in gyms. It was inherited from the ancient compromise between unpredictability and persistence. But it wasn't just physiology. The psychology of hunger evolved too. Early humans learned not to panic when food ran low. Panic wastes energy. Calm saves it. That composure became cultural, embedded in ritual and story. Hunger was personified as a guest, an occasional visitor who must be respected but not feared. It was this mental adaptation, not strength, not speed, that allowed humanity to cross deserts, survive winters, and settle impossible landscapes. The balance between feast and famine, then, wasn't just survival, it was identity. The body learned to shift, to store, to pause. Civilization, unfortunately, mistook that pause for a problem. The invention of agriculture, and later industrial food, broke the rhythm completely. The pendulum of nature was replaced by constant swing in one direction, abundance. And yet, deep down, the body still waits for the famine that never comes. Every cell hums with nostalgia for the old rhythm, for the long silences between meals that once made survival possible. That longing for rhythm, for struggle, for contrast, eventually found its answer not in biology, but in invention. Humans began to modify the world itself to match their needs, learning to cheat hunger not through patience, but through fire. Fire turned hunger into civilization. Before it, food was raw, endurance, tearing, chewing, waiting for the body to do what it wasn't quite built for. Then, somewhere around 1 million years ago, a lightning strike met a curious ape, and dinner began to glow. Cooking wasn't discovery, it was acceleration. It gave humans back their own energy. Archaeologists can trace that transformation through layers of ancient ash and burnt bone, through charred plant fibers and cracked stone hearths. Early Homo erectus, lean and long-legged, learned to tame fire, not for warmth first, but for digestion. Heat broke down fibers and proteins, softening the endless chewing of tubers and meat. A process that once consumed hours could now be handled by flame in minutes. Cooking predigested food, it did half the stomach's work before it even arrived. The result? More energy, less effort, and time, the rarest resource of all, freed for thinking, tool-making, and walking even farther in search of more. Anthropologists like Richard Wrangham call it the cooking hypothesis, that fire didn't just change food, it rewired the species. Smaller jaws, shorter intestines, bigger brains. It's an unromantic equation, but it holds true. Cooked calories built consciousness. The endurance that once meant surviving hunger evolved into something stranger, surviving abundance intelligently. Cooking also made food safer. The pathogens that had punished early foragers now hissed harmlessly in the fire. Spoilage slowed. Preservation began. What had been emergency improvisation became ritual and eventually culture. A roasted root was a victory. A shared stew was society. The hearth became the original social network, a circle of light in the endless dark, where eating and storytelling first merged. But this new power came with its own form of endurance, patience. Fire demanded attention, timing, care. Overcook, and you wasted the hunt. Undercook, and you invited death. The meal became choreography, not consumption. Archaeological hearths show evidence of shared maintenance, everyone contributing, everyone watching. It wasn't just eating together, it was surviving together. Cooking also gave rise to memory, both sensory and emotional. Smell, taste, the sight of smoke, all became signals of safety. The human brain learned to associate warmth with relief, flame with reward. Over time, those associations hardened into ritual. The first gods humanity worshipped weren't distant figures in the sky. They were the fire and the food that came from it. Even now, the modern kitchen carries that residue of reverence. Every stove is a domesticated altar, every meal a reenactment of the original truce between hunger and intelligence. But in the ancient world, that truce was still fragile. Fire could feed or destroy, nurture or consume. Every meal cooked was a gamble, an experiment in control over chaos. Still, it worked. Cooking extended life, expanded range, and allowed humanity to inhabit climates that would otherwise have starved it. It was the great equalizer, turning roots into bread, carcasses into stew, survival into endurance by design. And yet, even with fire's gift, no one ate alone for long, because food, for all its biology, was never just a private achievement. It was the language that bound groups together, the currency of trust, the proof that cooperation worked. No one truly eats alone in the story of humanity. Even when food was scarce, perhaps especially then, it had to be shared. Cooperation was the only insurance policy that worked, and mealtime was its ritual renewal. Every bowl passed around a fire, every portion divided unevenly on purpose, said the same thing: we survived together, or not at all. Anthropologists studying modern foragers, the Hadza in Tanzania, the Martu in Australia, Arctic seal hunters, forest gatherers, keep finding the same quiet rule written everywhere. Food belongs to the group. A hunter who keeps too much loses status. A generous one becomes immortal in reputation. Sharing wasn't charity, it was infrastructure. The pattern shows up in bones, in hearth layouts, in oral histories that go back farther than writing. Meals were never private affairs. They were miniature economies of gratitude and reciprocity. The best hunter gave the largest share to the weakest. The mother fed her neighbor's child before her own. The elders ate last, not because they were revered, but because they'd already survived enough hunger to know how. Food wasn't property, it was rhythm. There was an evolutionary logic behind the generosity. A full stomach is a fragile asset. It lasts hours. A reputation for sharing can last generations. When food was scarce, people traded calories for loyalty, meat for memory. And those memories, told and retold beside the hearth, became the first social contracts, oral, unspoken, but binding as law. Even the act of eating itself was social choreography. In Arctic and desert societies alike, the meal was a performance of balance. Who sat where? Who served first? Who received the sacred portion? These gestures weren't random etiquette. They distributed survival in a way that kept peace. The idea of manners probably began there, in the gap between hunger and hostility. A meal, shared fairly, prevented the world's oldest argument: who deserves to live today? Communal eating also gave hunger meaning. When everyone starved together, the emptiness felt sacred, not shameful. In many cultures, lean seasons were met with ritual feasts, paradoxical celebrations in the face of absence. The point wasn't indulgence. It was proof that solidarity was stronger than scarcity. In Arctic winters or drought-stricken valleys, to eat together was to declare that endurance had outlasted despair. There's an elegance to the anthropology of shared scarcity. It turns hunger into social architecture. Modern economics still hasn't improved on the principle. The earliest wealth redistribution was a hand passing food across firelight. What came after, taxes, charity, markets, was just bureaucratic reenactment. But within these humble circles of cooperation, another truth simmered quietly. Someone had to make all this work. While the rules of sharing kept the group alive, the labor of feeding it fell disproportionately on those least praised for it. Because the endurance that kept the species nourished was rarely celebrated as heroism. It was usually wearing an apron, or a bundle of roots, or a baby on the hip. If endurance had a face, for most of human history, it was a woman's bent over fire, scraping hides, stirring soup thickened with patience more than ingredients. Feeding others wasn't just duty, it was destiny. Across nearly every culture anthropologists have touched, the same image reappears. Women as the managers of scarcity, engineers of the impossible, turning almost nothing into continuity. In pre-agricultural societies, the division wasn't about strength, but strategy. Men hunted when luck allowed. Women gathered what never stopped growing: roots, berries, herbs, small creatures, the reliable backbone of daily survival. Archaeological residue on ancient grinding stones shows that plant food, gathered and processed mostly by women, often made up the majority of prehistoric calories. The myth of the man the hunter conveniently forgets that humanity was largely sustained by woman the provider. Endurance for them meant repetition, not glory. Every meal demanded calculation: how much to save, how much to share, how to stretch a pot of soup until the next uncertain day. In early agrarian societies, as fields replaced wildlands, this endurance only deepened. Women became the custodians of time itself, soaking, fermenting, drying, preserving, building small fortresses against famine. The first scientists were likely cooks, experimenting with decay until it became preservation. Yet, feeding others came with a cruel hierarchy. In many societies from India to the Mediterranean, from Arctic households to African villages, women ate last, often the least. Anthropologists recording household rituals in famine zones noted that women would quietly serve everyone else first, pretending to be full from tasting. It wasn't martyrdom, it was logistics. Someone had to make the math work. Even religion sanctified this burden. Goddesses of fertility and hearth, Isis, Hestia, Demeter, Pachamama, were celebrated not for power, but for sustenance. They represented the moral weight of keeping others alive. To feed was divine, to hunger was human, and so women embodied both at once. Through colonial and industrial transitions, the pattern survived stubbornly. In Arctic and sub-Saharan contexts alike, women became mediators between old survival systems and new disruptions, rationing imported flour, combining it with native fats or roots, recalibrating nutrition for a world that suddenly supplied everything and nothing at once. Feeding others was still an act of adaptation, and occasionally rebellion, keeping ancestral knowledge alive beneath the weight of modern abundance. Endurance, in that sense, was never neutral. It was inherited, performed daily, and rarely acknowledged. The ability to keep feeding a family through hunger and heat, snow and shortage, became the invisible infrastructure of survival, as vital as fire, as overlooked as air. And it wasn't just physical labor, it was emotional triage, calming hungry children, soothing egos, managing the fragile peace between appetite and scarcity. Food became the medium through which love, authority, and exhaustion all mingled, a slow, unending performance of care that outlived most civilizations. Still, this gendered burden of endurance, repeated over millennia, transformed the act of eating itself. For many women, and for entire societies shaped by their resilience, food became sacred long before religion claimed it. And that sanctity of endurance, born from everyday hunger, would soon evolve into something larger, a faith all its own. Somewhere between empty stomachs and full altars, hunger crossed the line from biological event to divine language. What began as a necessity, not eating because there was nothing to eat, became ritual, not eating because the gods were listening. It's a very human twist, really. The same endurance that once kept people alive now became proof they deserved to be. Across continents, abstaining from food turned into conversation with the invisible. In ancient Egypt, fasting preceded temple entry. Among Hindu ascetics, it purified karma. Among desert mystics and early Christians, it erased the distance between flesh and spirit. In Islam, Ramadan codified restraint into rhythm, a daily rehearsal of gratitude and control. In every case, hunger stopped being a symptom of poverty and became a medium of power. Anthropologists have long pointed out that fasting appeared independently in cultures that never met. There's something almost universal in how people interpret emptiness as holiness. The act itself rewires perception. Senses sharpen, thoughts slow, time stretches. The world feels thinner, as if a membrane between the human and the divine dissolves. The biochemical explanation is simple: low blood sugar and endorphin release, but the experience feels like revelation. In Arctic cultures, where scarcity was seasonal and inevitable, the line between fasting and survival was thin. Shamans embraced starvation deliberately, believing visions required hunger. Among Siberian and North American tribes, long fasts were initiation proof that a person could cross into the spirit world and back without breaking. The lesson wasn't deprivation, it was control. The ability to endure one's own hunger became a measure of wisdom. Even outside religion, the pattern persists. In early agrarian societies, entire festivals revolved around collective restraint. Fields left fallow, tables left empty, mouths silent. It wasn't just symbolism, it was ecological synchronization. By pausing consumption, people mirrored the landscape's own rest. They called it worship. We might call it sustainability. The irony, of course, is that endurance, once sacred, has become punishment in the modern world. Where fasting was once a doorway to transcendence, it's now a detox. The same chemical storm that inspired prophets now fuels wellness trends. Ancient monks sought emptiness for clarity. Influencers sell it for abs. Humanity has a talent for rebranding holiness into marketing. Still, the original meaning lingers like smoke after the flame. To be hungry was to remember one's place in the order of things, small, temporary, dependent. Hunger humbled the human ego. It taught patience and reverence far better than sermons ever could. And when that hunger finally ended, when food returned, it wasn't gluttony that followed, but gratitude. Every bite was sacred because it had been earned through restraint. The body, after days of silence, celebrated its own endurance. That reverence for food, born of fasting and survival, would eventually shape something larger than religion, the very identity of what it meant to be human in a world that could take food away at any moment. When food finally returned after long hunger, it wasn't simply consumed, it was worshipped. Every feast was a ceremony, a collective exhale after surviving the quiet violence of scarcity. To eat in plenty was to remember the thinness of the months before, and to swear, silently or aloud, that one would never take it for granted again. Archaeologists have found this instinct fossilized in celebration. From ancient Mesopotamian harvest feasts to Paleolithic gatherings marked by broken animal bones and scattered pigments, abundance was rarely private. It was a communal relief ritual, an acknowledgement that luck, weather, and work had aligned just long enough to justify indulgence. Anthropologists studying early agrarian festivals, Sumerian, Akitu, the Greek, Thesp, Andean harvest rites, all describe the same choreography: fasting, then frenzy, then peace, a pattern old as hunger itself. Feasting was never just about food, it was remembrance disguised as joy. The overfilled tables, the smoke, the dancing, all of it said the same thing: we survived. Every roasted animal and fermented drink was an edible monument to endurance. People didn't eat more because they were greedy, they ate more because they were scared. You can almost hear the echo in modern celebrations. Christmas, Eid, Thanksgiving, all dressed up gratitude with a nervous undertone, as if eating more could ward off the return of famine. Even the structure of feasts carried anthropology's favorite contradiction: abundance used to reinforce hierarchy. Kings and priests ate first, their plates heavy with symbolism. The rest ate in trickle-down sanctity, performing gratitude for their portion. Yet, despite inequality, feasting had one democratic feature: it demanded participation. A feast of one wasn't a feast. The body's need became social theater. Archaeologists have noted that feasting often preceded major cultural leaps, alliances, marriages, truces, even revolutions. Because when people eat together after hunger, they become, for a few brief hours, the same species again. The walls between tribes, classes, and grievances soften under the influence of shared fat and fermented drink. Food, at its peak, dissolved politics. Still, under the laughter and smoke, there was always a quiet fear. Abundance felt temporary, unstable. Feast and famine were lovers. One always followed the other. So, every celebration contained its own warning. The first grain stored, the first bone buried, the first toast raised, all were ways of whispering to the gods, "Please, not again." Even today, traces of that fear survive. Our holidays still oscillate between indulgence and guilt. We call it overeating, dieting, detoxing, but it's the same ancient pendulum swinging between plenty and control. The psychology of hunger never really left. It just wears better clothes. Feasting, then, was not the end of endurance, but its mirror. Every overflowing table existed to remind people that emptiness could return at any moment. Abundance was a story we told ourselves to make peace with fragility. And as civilizations grew, temples, cities, empires, that fragile relationship with food deepened into something systemic. Survival became management, endurance became governance, and the act of eating evolved from ritual into regulation. Once humans figured out how to grow food, someone immediately figured out how to own it. The invention of agriculture didn't just feed civilization, it created hierarchy. A field of grain was wealth that didn't move, which meant someone had to stand over it, guard it, and, naturally, claim divine authority while doing so. Hunger, which had once been a shared experience, became a tool. Whoever could feed the people could also rule them. Archaeological records from the earliest city-states, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, all tell the same story in different scripts. Food was centralized, measured, and distributed from the top down. Clay tablets and granaries became the first bureaucracies, temple economies. Anthropologists call them a polite phrase for the oldest form of control. Priests and kings counted grain not just to prevent famine, but to ration obedience. The stomach became the first political leash. The evidence is everywhere. In ancient Egypt, harvest records carved into stone weren't about celebrating abundance. They were about surveillance. In Mesopotamia, rations of beer and bread were the currency of labor. Workers paid in calories rather than coins. The Roman Empire learned the same trick with panem et circenses, bread and circus. Feed the citizens, entertain them, and they won't ask too many questions about who controls the ovens. Even famine became political theater. A drought could mean divine punishment, conveniently interpreted by those in power. A poor harvest could justify taxes, wars, or new temples. The narrative of hunger turned into an instrument of legitimacy. Those who fed the people were gods. Those who failed were replaced. In the long arc of history, no ruler feared rebellion as much as an empty granary. Anthropologists studying colonial economies find the same principle recycled endlessly. In every empire, from Spanish to British, control of food was control of people. Rations on ships, sugar in colonies, salt monopolies, all mechanisms to bind bodies through appetite. Even modern global politics, with its subsidies and export tariffs, is just a more complicated version of the same equation. Hunger equals leverage. Ironically, the ones who once survived by mastering endurance became the most dependent on systems that removed it. The skills that had kept humanity alive, fasting, patience, sharing, were replaced by institutions that sold those very virtues back in smaller, packaged forms. The ancient cycle of feast and famine became an industry. The stomach, once the site of human humility, became its leash, predictable, profitable, and programmable. Modern supermarkets are temples of abundance, where famine is simulated only for aesthetic purposes. Low stock, limited edition, last batch. Civilization's great joke is that the farther we move from hunger, the more we fear it. Yet beneath all the control and abundance, the ancient rhythm still hums quietly. Our bodies, descendants of famine survivors, still wait for the long pause, still expect scarcity to return. Every diet, every detox, every ritual of restraint is a faint echo of that primal wisdom, that survival wasn't about constant fullness, it was about enduring the space between. And maybe that's the lesson the stomach never forgot. That endurance, in the end, isn't about what we eat. It's about what we can live without, and still remain human.